The spinal cord is part of the central nervous system and begins where the nervous tissue exits the cranial cavity through the foramen magnum. Technically, it's a continuation of the brainstem, and we describe it as being the spinal cord where it comes out of the cranial cavity, where it exits the skull. The spinal cord runs down the dorsal surface of the body through the vertebral cavity, which is created by all of the canals of all the vertebrae when they come together to form the vertebral column. So, the adjacent vertebral arches of all of the vertebrae, when they come together, form the vertebral canal. And again, the spinal cord runs through this canal that's created when all of these vertebrae come together and runs down the dorsal aspect of the body. Arising from the spinal cord are the spinal nerves. They exit in pairs and exit between the vertebrae through the intervertebral foramina. The intervertebral foramina are also formed by the adjacent vertebrae as they come together. The spinal cord has two primary functions. First, it conducts nerve impulses to and from the brain, and second, it serves as a center for spinal reflexes. The pictures to the right show you both an artist's reconstruction of the spinal cord, highlighting in the large rectangle where it exits the brain and exits the cranial cavity, as well as an actual cadaver dissection showing you the same area. If you look at the above image, you can see where the cerebellum is, and then you can see the terminus of the medulla, which marks the brainstem coming out of the brain, and then right about here is where the spinal cord would be exiting the cranial cavity, and then you can see it continues on as the spinal cord. Additionally, you can also see the little rootlets coming out of the dorsal aspect of the spinal cord, which are going to combine with rootlets on the ventral surface to form the spinal nerves, which, as you can see down here in the lower image, are going to exit between the adjacent vertebra through those intervertebral canals. In terms of general gross anatomy, there's a number of structures that we need to highlight. Already having mentioned the pairs of spinal nerves, you can see in this image that they're loosely arranged in terms of the vertebrae where they exit the spinal cord. So you've got the cervical nerves, the thoracic nerves, the lumbar nerves, the sacral nerves, and we'll talk more about those in a little bit. Also visible in gross section are two spinal cord enlargements. These occur in the cervical and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Normally, the width of the cord is about roughly equivalent to your thumb. However, in these two areas, the diameter of the cord increases, and if you're looking at the cord, you can see this enlargement here in the cervical region and down here in the lumbar region as well. These enlargements represent an increase in the amount of gray matter that we will see later on in further slides. The spinal cord does not physically run the entire length of the vertebral canal. You can see in this diagram how it terminates at about the level of L1 or L2 in a structure that tapers down to a point. That point is called the conus medullaris, and it represents the end of the spinal cord proper. Posterior to the conus medullaris, the remaining spinal nerve roots project downward through the vertebral canal as a collection of nerve roots that is referred to as the cauda equina. Cauda equina literally translates to back end of a horse, and is named such because the first anatomists who observed the structure thought it looked like the tail on a horse. Also projecting posteriorly from the conus medullaris is a long fibrous extension that is also covered by the pia mater, one of the meninges that covers the central nervous system, called the filum terminale. The filum terminale anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx to help prevent jostling and other potential injury from sharp motions. So if we look at this image, as you can see here, is a close-up showing the distal end of the lumbar vertebra at or about the level of L5. And what you're seeing here is the space in the vertebral canal that's created as a result of the termination of the spinal cord, and at this point all you have are those nerve roots running down the length of the vertebral canal. This area, called the subarachnoid space, below the conus medullaris, is, as many other areas within the central nervous system, filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Sometimes doctors need to take a sample of this cerebrospinal fluid for testing. When they do this, it's called a lumbar puncture because they insert the needle between lumbar vertebrae and into the subarachnoid space, and they can do this because of that extra space in there, because of the termination of the spinal cord as a whole. This procedure is commonly also referred to as a spinal tap. At this point, we're going to switch and view the spinal cord in cross-section. What you're seeing here is an artist's reconstruction of a cross-section of the spinal cord in the cervical region. You can tell it's a cervical region because cervical vertebrae, as you learned in your skeletal section, all have these intervertebral foramina in their transverse processes. At this point, the level at which the cross-section is taken doesn't matter too much, but it's just a way of showing you what kind of information you can get just by looking at a particular diagram. Looking at the spinal cord in cross-section allows us to see a number of other structures that we can't see just by looking at the outside of the spinal cord, even if we're looking at the entire length of the spinal cord. This view allows us to see both internal structures and structures that are repeated in each of the different sections of the spinal cord. Those sections are represented by each of the spinal nerves where they exit the spinal cord. From this view, we can see a pair of grooves, one on the dorsal surface of the spinal cord, that's called the dorsal median sulcus, sometimes called the posterior median sulcus, and we can see another one on the ventral surface of the spinal cord. This is called the ventral or anterior median fissure. These two grooves run down the entire length of the cord, and as you can see, they partially bisect it. There's a little bit of a connection in between the two grooves where nerve fibers can cross from one side to the other, but for the most part these grooves bisect the spinal cord into right and left halves. Also visible in this image are the two different types of nervous tissue. We have the gray matter that you can see is primarily deep within the spinal cord, although there are a few horn-like structures that will project out to the surface. But for the most part, this gray matter, which represents unmyelinated fibers and primarily cell bodies, runs deep within the spinal cord, and you can see that it bisects or partially bisects the white matter, which primarily represents myelinated fibers. There are some unmyelinated fibers in the white matter as well, but it's the myelin that actually creates the visible white color to this tissue. So the white matter is around the outside, and the gray matter lies deep within the white matter, and as you can see, it partially separates or differentiates the white matter into a number of different sections. We'll talk about what those sections are called and the importance of those sections later on in the lecture. In this image, we can see both a partial cross-section of the spinal cord, and we can also see a small length of the cord itself. So this particular image is good for showing both some cross-sectional anatomy as well as it gives you an idea of what the individual sections of the spinal cord look like. Now, from the outside, you're not going to have bisections or any other partitioning off the different sections, but we can talk about the sections in terms of the regions of the spinal cord where the spinal nerves exit. So each of these sections gives rise to one of 31 pairs of spinal nerves. You can see 3 of those pairs of nerves in this image, and as we mentioned before, each of these pairs exits between the intervertebral foramina that are created when the adjacent vertebrae come together to form the vertebral column. We can also get another look, a slightly better look, at the structure of the gray matter and how it bisects the different areas of the white matter. We can see a number of point-like or horn-like projections within the gray matter, and these are actually referred to as horns. There's one that projects dorsally, that's referred to as the posterior or the dorsal horn. There's one that projects ventrally, that's referred to as the anterior or the ventral horn. And there's also a smaller one that projects laterally called the lateral horn. One of the very important jobs of the spinal cord is to relay motor impulses that are going to stimulate skeletal muscle in various areas of the body. Now, the gray matter in the spinal cord reflects the amount of skeletal muscle that is innervated at that level of the spinal cord. The limbs contain significant amounts of skeletal muscle, the upper and lower limbs. And this is why you have those enlargements in the cervical and lumbar regions. The nerve plexuses going down to innervate the upper and lower limbs originate from these areas. And there's more gray matter in these regions of the spinal cord because of the increased amount of skeletal muscle, and as a result, you get these slightly enlarged regions of the spinal cord. Also visible in this image is a structure called the gray commissure. The gray commissure is a small connection of gray matter that connects the two lateral enlarged regions. And in some cases, you do have nerve fibers which cross over from one side of the spinal cord to the other. Also visible within the gray commissure is a structure called the central canal. The central canal, as the name implies, is a structure. It runs down the length of the spinal cord and it is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. We can also get a good look at the white matter regions surrounding the gray matter. These are arranged in columns around the gray matter, and they are referred to collectively as funiculi. Singular would be funiculus. So on either side, we've got the posterior funiculus, which represents one of the so-called white columns. Laterally, we've got the lateral funiculus, and then in front, we have the anterior funiculus. And again, these represent columns of white matter, and we'll see later on in the lecture that there are nerve pathways that run either up or down through these columns of white matter. I mentioned earlier that there are rootlets that exit on the dorsal and ventral aspect of the spinal cord. These rootlets, in turn, come together to form structures called the dorsal root and the ventral root. These two roots are the pathways through which axons either enter or leave the spinal cord. The two roots, in turn, will coalesce to form the actual spinal nerve, which exits through that intervertebral foramina. This particular image is showing you a segment of the spinal cord and the dorsal and ventral roots, but it's also showing you sensory and motor neurons and their cell bodies and axons and how those sensory and motor neurons are arranged. The dorsal root has general sensory function. In other words, the nerve fibers that run through the dorsal root are sensory. These are coming from sensory receptors somewhere in the periphery of the body, and the axons are going to run through the dorsal root and eventually into the gray matter of the spinal cord through the dorsal root and junction there with neuron cell bodies located within the gray matter. The cell bodies of these sensory neurons are located in a cluster in the dorsal root, and they form an enlargement in the dorsal root called the dorsal root ganglion. And this is where all of the cell bodies for these sensory neurons are located. The ventral root has general motor function. In other words, the neurons whose axons are exiting the spinal cord through the ventral root are going to be stimulating skeletal muscles or other effectors within the body at this level. Also located within the gray matter are interneurons, which can provide a number of different functions, but as their name implies, they generally connect other neurons. They will sometimes connect sensory and motor neurons to help form reflex arcs, and they will also sometimes connect these neurons to other neurons in either ascending or descending pathways, depending on the nature of the input or output. So now let's look at the white matter. As we mentioned earlier, the white matter is separated by the gray matter into these three general columns: the ventral or anterior funiculus, the lateral funiculus, and the dorsal or posterior funiculus. Well, again, there are sensory pathways that run up and down the spinal cord through the white matter. Ascending pathways tend to run upwards, carrying sensory information from the periphery of the body to the brain, and descending pathways do the opposite. They run downwards, carrying motor information from the brain out to the effectors and muscles of the body. There are also some transverse, or what we call commissural pathways, that allow neurons to connect one side of the spinal cord to the other. We're now going to look at some of the individual ascending and descending pathways and what types of information they carry in the form of their nerve impulses. And we'll start with the ascending pathways. The ascending pathways, as I mentioned earlier, conduct sensory impulses to the brain. They're continuous over the entire length of the spinal cord, and they typically have 3 neuron nerve pathways, and those pathways are made up of what we call first, second, and third order neurons. And many of these pathways cross over to the other side of the spinal cord at some point as they run up the spinal cord. Many of these pathways cross over at the level of the medulla. The first order neurons, as you can see in this image, their cell bodies typically reside in the dorsal root ganglion, and they conduct impulses from those cutaneous receptors or the proprioreceptors that are in the periphery of the body to the spinal cord. The second order neurons, their cell bodies reside within the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, which is also where they junction with those first order neurons, and they will send impulses up the spinal cord to the thalamus or the cerebellum. The third order neurons, their cell bodies are located within the thalamus, and those neurons will relay impulses to the cerebrum, very specifically the somatosensory cortex within the cerebrum. We're going to discuss 3 specific pathways of ascending neurons. One called the dorsal column or medial lemniscal, the spinothalamic pathways, and the spinocerebellar pathways. The dorsal column pathways are made up of 2 specific sets of nerve tracts, and you can see they're highlighted here in red. They're called the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. These pathways mediate direct transmission of inputs from a single type of receptor that can typically be localized precisely to a point on the body's surface. And these will give you impressions of things like discriminated touch or vibration in terms of their sensory interpretations. The fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus, as you can see in the diagram, are located in the posterior funiculi of the spinal cord. And again, they conduct sensory impulses from sensory receptors in the skin and various other proprioreceptors, and again can be interpreted as sensations of discriminative touch, pressure, and general overall body sense. The medial lemniscus, which is the other name of the overall pathway that we're talking about here, is specifically from the medulla in the brainstem to the thalamus. So it's not going to be in the spinal cord proper. The next set of ascending pathways are the spinothalamic pathways, made up collectively of the lateral spinothalamic tract and the anterior spinothalamic tract, which are located in the lateral funiculus and the anterior funiculus of either side of the spinal cord, respectively. Like many other pathways, impulses in these tracts will cross over at the level of the medulla to the other side of the brain, where afterwards they will make multiple synapses within the brainstem. The lateral tracts conduct impulses to the brain that give rise to sensations generally of pain and temperature, and the impulses carried on the anterior tracts are typically interpreted as things like crude touch and pressure. The last of the ascending tracts that we're going to be discussing are the spinocerebellar pathways. These pathways are composed of the posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts. And both of these tracts are near the surface of the lateral funiculus. Impulses carried along these tracts don't typically contribute to any sort of conscious sensation, but what they will do is they'll help convey information to the brain regarding muscle or tendon stretch. These impulses help the cerebellum to coordinate muscular movements by way of utilizing this information. Now let's discuss the descending pathways. Descending pathways conduct motor impulses from the brain to the various effectors of the body. Effectors, as you learned earlier, include skeletal muscles as well as internal organs, things like glands, that serve to affect a change within the body. There are two basic types of descending pathways, what we call direct and indirect pathways. The direct pathways originate mainly within the pyramidal neurons within the precentral gyrus of the brain. And these direct pathways use a two-neuron pathway made up of upper motor neurons, those would be the pyramidal cells within the motor cortex, and lower motor neurons. These lower motor neurons would be those ventral horn motor neurons that we discussed earlier. And these neurons are the ones that innervate the skeletal muscles. These are referred to as direct pathways because they don't synapse with any other neurons before entering the cord. They will send impulses through the brainstem via the corticospinal tracts, which we'll discuss in a minute. The indirect pathways, which we will also talk about in a minute, include essentially all the other motor pathways. These tend to use very complex multisynaptic pathways. So we're going to look at the 5 primary sets of descending pathways: the corticospinal, reticulospinal, rubrospinal, tectospinal, and vestibulospinal tracts. We'll start with the direct pathways that are comprised of the corticospinal tracts. There are 2 primary corticospinal tracts on either side of the spinal cord: the lateral corticospinal tract, located in the lateral funiculus, and the anterior corticospinal tract, located in the anterior funiculus. Motor impulses from the brain travel down these tracts to the spinal nerves, which will eventually generate the nerves that innervate the various skeletal muscles on the opposite side of the body. Next, let's talk about the indirect pathways, starting with the reticulospinal pathways. There are 3 primary tracts that make up the reticulospinal pathways: the lateral reticulospinal tracts, the medial reticulospinal tracts, and even though it's not shown in this diagram, there are also anterior reticulospinal tracts. Motor impulses on the reticulospinal tracts originate in the brain, and they will go out and generate general muscle tone and facilitate other visceral motor functions. The rubrospinal pathways are conducted through the rubrospinal tracts, which also pass through the lateral funiculi. They will carry motor impulses from the brain to the various skeletal muscles within the body, in particular helping to coordinate many of the various flexor muscles, often associated with the various limbs. The tectospinal pathways, facilitated by the tectospinal tracts, are located in the anterior funiculi, and these help to mediate head movement, particularly in response to visual stimuli. One of the things that these impulses carried on these tracts do is they help to turn the neck so that your eyes can track and follow objects. Finally, we have the vestibulospinal tracts that are located in the anterior funiculi. Motor impulses transmitted along these tracts help to do a number of things. They help to maintain muscle tone, they help to activate same-side limb and trunk extensor and head movement muscles, and they help to maintain balance, particularly when standing and moving. So at the beginning of the lecture, we talked about how one of the primary functions of the spinal cord was to serve as a center for reflexes. What you're seeing here is a generalized image showing you the parts of a reflex arc. We're not going to go into a whole lot of detail right now because we'll be talking more about reflex arcs in the future, but just for clarity, the parts of a reflex arc include the receptor, which is sensitive to some sort of sensory input in the periphery, perhaps a pain or temperature receptor in the skin, or maybe a joint receptor in a tendon, and that receptor will be responsive to a particular type of stimulus. It will become excited and send an impulse along a sensory neuron, and that sensory neuron will enter the spinal cord, where the impulse will be transmitted perhaps to an interneuron within the spinal cord, but not always. Some reflexes do not have interneurons, and in some cases the sensory neuron will just junction directly with a motor neuron. Whether or not there is an interneuron in this case isn't important for our purposes, but that impulse will then be conveyed to the motor neuron, where it will then innervate some sort of effector. In this particular case, what we have is a pain reflex, so what's going to happen is the effector muscle is going to cause the part of the body to pull away from whatever is causing that stimulus. And this is a reflex. In other words, it's typically subconscious. You can't control it with conscious thought, and it acts completely in the absence of conscious thought. You don't have to tell your hand to pull away from a hot stove if you put it on a hot stove. It just happens. And these reflexes, the subconscious portion of the reflexes, happen because of the fact that the spinal cord serves as an important relay center, housing the neurons and allowing for the connections between the different neurons that are going to convey the stimulus from the sensory neuron ultimately to an effector, which will cause some sort of change.